Hello, everyone. It's me, David Chen. Welcome to the YouTube channel at youtube.com/Dave Chensky. That's Dave Chen, SKY. And also my Patreon page at patreon.com/Dave Chen. For the last 5 weeks or so, we've been broadcasting every week after the newest episode of Loki has aired on Disney Plus. We're recapping every episode, we're spoiling every episode, we're diving in, sharing our brutally honest thoughts. And joining me for this entire journey, filled with glorious purpose, his name is Dan Gvozden from the Amazing Spider Talk podcast. Dan Gvozden, your environs look a little bit different today. Where are you, Dan Gvozden?
Yeah, I'm actually in Maryland. I just flew here from California, so it's about midnight my time. I'm visiting family and enjoying a little bit of vacation as I have been. I mean, you know what you gotta do to make these Loki podcasts work. And despite it being midnight, I'm excited to talk to you about this episode for a number of reasons. I'm sure we'll get to.
I am incredibly impressed with Dan Gvozden's dedication. You have now recorded this 6-episode podcast from 3 different cities in the country, basically, right?
Yeah, I'm
You
uh,
really-
I'm all over the place. I
You're
don't know what
on
else to say.
average 2 episodes per city in this
This is a
thing.
very bad representation of what my life is actually like.
Dan is a globe-trotting playboy, is basically what is happening.
That's exactly right.
All right, so before we get into this week's episode, which is Season 1, Episode 6, For All Time Always, I want to say a few kind of general words about this thing that we've been doing on YouTube and on my Patreon page, right? These episodes are available on my YouTube channel, but if you want the high-quality audio version, you got to go to patreon.com/Dave Chen. And people who enjoy my work, support me, go to patreon.com/Dave Chen. They have access to not only podcast version of this podcast, but a bunch of other bonus content, audio, video, all this stuff that I'm making there as well. So really appreciate you if you are supporting me there. And again, another shout out to amazingspidertalk.com, which is where you can find Dan Gvozden's podcast.
Yeah, I would
I
love it if people came and joined me over there. We have a lot of fun talking about comics and stuff.
I have had a lot of fun doing these episodes with you, Dan Gvozden, specifically about Loki. What's been so great about it is also like consistently we get over 100 people show up every week in the YouTube channel, and they're sharing their thoughts and their reflections on the episode, and it's just been like such a great time to do this. And so I want to again say appreciation to all the folks at patreon.com/Dave Chen. It's literally because of them that we can do this. I am paying Dan Gvozden tens of thousands of dollars to talk to me because he refuses to do so otherwise. No, I'm just joking. But I am paying Dan Gvozden, and like this stuff doesn't just happen automatically. Like we are very grateful to the folks who are making this possible. But that said, have had so much fun doing it. And so all that being said, I do want to say that we are going to try to continue doing this more often. And there's another Marvel show coming down the pike, the What If animated show. We're going to try to cover that one. There's this Hawkeye show that like I have absolutely no interest in. It's like Falcon and Winter Soldier Part 2. It could be for all I care, but we could have some fun talking about it. So if you want to stay up to date on our coverage of these shows, there's 2 ways to do that. Number 1 is subscribe to this YouTube channel, hit like, hit that notification icon. Number 2 is become a patron, patreon.com/Dave Chen, and you'll be kept up to date on everything that's happening with me and Dan going into the future. So thanks
David,
to Dan.
I didn't realize you were so hard up for friends. I could have asked for more. I
It's so
can
true.
only take so much of you calling me by my full name.
It's 100% true, and I'm glad I hid my lack of friends from you. So yeah, this has just been so fun. Thanks to everyone again who showed up, who's been a patron, who's like enabled us to do this. It's been just an absolute blast. Even if we haven't liked some episodes or haven't liked some things about the episodes, that's what this whole thing is about, guys. It's about us figuring out our feelings about this stuff. So, okay. Before we get into this episode, I also want to say that there was a couple things you wanted to bring up about last week's episode, right, Dan Gvozden? Loki episode 5 that you wanted to follow up on.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to follow up on was something that a listener or viewer pointed out that I didn't mention, and they were surprised I didn't mention, which was at the end of the episode, during the big fight with Eliath, or right before the fight with Eliath, there was a giant looking like rock statue head, which was actually from the Living Tribunal, a character that I brought up in early episodes here and got confused with the Timekeepers. And they were like, I can't believe Dan didn't bring it up when it actually showed up on the show. And I just wanted to say, last episode, there was so much to cover, so many Easter eggs. We really kind of had to, press on with the important stuff. But don't think I didn't miss the Living Tribunal and his head just chilling in the background of episode 5. So I just wanted to say, like, I definitely saw it. Don't worry, all the people out there who know that I love the Living Tribunal and thought I missed it.
All right. We would never want people to think that you missed something.
No.
But on that note, why don't we dive into this episode? Okay, so we're going to spoil episode 6, For All Time Always. And I want to start by saying, Dan Gvozden, you called it. You called it kind of. Kind of.
I pointed into the outfield, and I believe I hit a home run.
It was at least
I feel
a
fairly confident.
It was at least a triple.
So I think what you're implying here is you want to like get all hung up on the like fine details of it all.
Okay. So for those who don't know what we're talking about, and this is your first time tuning into this podcast / YouTube broadcast, Dan Gvozden has been predicting basically since episode 1 that Kang the Conqueror would appear at the end of this series, would be a critical part of the series, and he's a character from the comic books. We know that Jonathan Majors was cast as Kang the Conqueror. And Jonathan Majors shows up. Now, the little asterisk next to that thing of Dan calling this really well is at no point during the entire episode is the word Kang uttered by any character, as far as I can recall, right? Instead, this guy that Jonathan Majors plays is referred to as he who remains, right?
Well, he even jokes about it, saying, "Oh, some people still call me that."
Yeah.
But I've been called the Conqueror, Kang the Conqueror, and my no prize.
No. Actually, Dan, I've been called the Conqueror. The Conqueror, not Kang. No one says the word Kang at any point. Now, maybe don't you think it's possible that Kang is like one of the variants? I guess technically they'd all be Kang, but like maybe Kang the Conqueror is the guy we see at the end of the episode. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that was going to be my no prize. Is like if we're not going to consider this guy Kang, at the very least, the guy at the end is Kang.
Okay, fair enough. Also, people are human help in the chat says home run for sure. So yeah.
And I want to say this.
Jim McMahon is saying, "Come on, David." People are really on your side in the chat room, by the way. Yeah.
I want to say I've never backed down from this either. Like I have believed it even when people doubted. I always thought that this was going to happen.
You should. I mean, you rightly should enjoy your winnings in this case, right? You called it for the most part, and I think you deserve a lot of credit for it, for real. So
I also want to take claim to last episode saying that I thought that Sylvie would turn on Loki. And I think maybe I get like a half point for that because that definitely happened here too.
Yeah. I mean, not even a half point in my opinion. Like that is a full point, right? Like, okay. So yeah, totally. Victor Leung says ground rule double with a throwing error charged to the third baseman. Maybe not a home run, but ground rule double.
Hey David, if we're handing out points, I want to return to your whole theory about the themes of this show.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still think that this is like a show about what did you say? The prison and industrial complex?
The criminal justice system, the American criminal justice system.
That's it. How do you feel about that now that we've come to a conclusion here?
Wow, Dan, you're really coming out guns blazing, huh? I mean, in a way, the Conqueror, aka He Who Remains, represents the judge in a criminal court setting, and with the ability to decide who lives and who dies, and he's obviously torn up by the capriciousness of the whole system. So my answer to your question is, I feel pretty good about myself, Dan.
All right. I think I went cross-eyed trying to understand how that all fit together
Oh,
there,
oh,
but
wow.
but
Okay.
I'll
Okay.
assign you a point. I'll assign you a point.
Okay. Okay.
I'm being generous. I'm going to give you one of my points.
Oh, that's so nice. That's so nice.
Yeah.
So Dan Gvozden's suggestion was that we actually spend most of our time today talking, like less recapping and more talking about our reaction to the episode. So we'll recap a few things, but there's a lot to react to. What are your big takeaways from this episode, Dan Gvozden?
Well, the first one is, I mean, in terms of my just broad reaction, I was watching this while I was flying across the country on Southwest Wi-Fi on the
Right.
plane, which is
And was it an iPad or was it on your iPhone? Like what?
no, it was on my MacBook Pro,
Oh, okay, okay. So
and
the best way to enjoy the visual splendor of Loki, by the way, is watching it on your laptop on airplane Wi-Fi.
yeah, no, not exactly. Although I will say, this points out an error in Southwest system is that they block all streaming services, but I guess Disney Plus is too new, so they haven't
Mm,
blocked it, and you could
mm.
you could still watch it. So I like seriously slipped in there. Um,
Basically, everyone's Wi-Fi on the airplane was slow except for yours. Like you were hogging 90% of the bandwidth on that plane.
I mean, worth it, I think. But that is to say that by the end of this episode, I was audibly clapping on board a public or ever plane,
Uh huh. Uh huh.
and so in my immediate reaction to it, I loved so much about it. Um, I think in the time since, so like I guess maybe 5 or 6 hours, some kind of split there is a Nexus event in my
In
opinion
your
about
your opinion, okay, got it.
yeah. um I like thinking more about why characters have done the things that they've done and how satisfying it was to, and I think we discussed this last episode, like that maybe it's a King Loki at the end of this. Like how much does the Kang of it all, if you want to call it Kang, which I'm going to call it Kang, I'm just going to revel in that. um how much does that,
Fair.
take away from the themes and ideas in the show? And I think for the most part it really works, but I do feel like Loki himself is a bit shortchanged in this episode, and the arc of Loki is therefore shortchanged. And I expect this episode, will be controversial, and the internet. I don't know if it's actually reflecting this, but I think there will be a split between those who find this ending unfulfilling and those who will find it exciting, and then those who find it somewhere in between, both exciting and unfulfilling. And I think I'm kind of more on the exciting end of it, but the my feelings of, oh, did this rob us of a better ending to this, are creeping in,
Mm.
and we can discuss the reasons for that. But I'm kind of curious where you're at, David, before we get too
Yeah.
deep.
Okay. So I think at this point we have now seen over like almost 2 dozen movies, maybe about 2 dozen Marvel movies, and 3 entire MCU, like Marvel Studios TV shows or seasons of TV shows, right? So like we have a pretty good sense of how this stuff operates. And I think if you go into Loki expecting that it is going to have probably approximately 20 to 30% is tying into the rest of the MCU, like acknowledging slash improving past things and setting up things for the future. And then like the remaining 70 to 80% is original storytelling, like self-contained original storytelling. If you go in expecting that, then I think that Loki delivers. Like overall, I think I had a great time with the show. It's by far the best of the 3 TV series, in my opinion.
I agree.
It made me think about the nature of time and life, and of you know whether or not there is a god, like all these like big, like whether or not we can transcend our true selves, like all these things that I'm thinking about that this show stirred up for me. And at the same time as it did all those things, also like I don't know if I mentioned, like just visually spectacular, like on a very basic technical level, impressive on a week to week basis. At the same time that all that stuff is true, really enjoyable, great, best of the MCU series, like all that stuff I just said. At the same time as all that's true, all that other setting up other things for Marvel BS robs it of being a satisfying, complete, self-contained story. Now, many people will instantly rejoin and say, "Well, it's not trying to be that. It's trying to be something else." And I get
Yeah.
that. I just finished acknowledging that. Like,
I have
I,
always pushed back against that when
right.
I like, especially early on in the MCU, when they would assign critics to review them, and they would all say like, "Well, you couldn't just enjoy this," and it's like, "No, you don't understand. That is not the point."
Well, I mean, yes, you're right. Like, basically, what I'm saying is, as long as you set your expectations correctly, right? I think
Right.
this is probably one of the finest examples of the form. However, people who are used to watching a season of television and feeling like every character was relatively well developed, every character had their own arc that was satisfying, are likely to feel disappointed. This finale commits certain screenwriting crimes, let's say, that if it wasn't MCU, if it wasn't a TV show that's going to have another season, which, by the way, I didn't see that coming. I don't think a lot of people didn't see it coming that there's going to be a Loki season 2.
I had heard the rumors about it, but I didn't want to believe it until I saw it on screen. So
Yeah.
I was shocked, even if I kind of already knew it was going to happen.
The whole season is leading up to this mystery of who's behind this thing, what is their role, what's the purpose of all this. And so this episode was going to have to do some heavy lifting. I was actually shocked when I pressed play on my Disney Plus and saw that it was 46 minutes or whatever. I was like, of which like 4 or 5 minutes is credits. I'm like, oh, wow, they're going to really wrap this up in like 42 minutes or whatever. And so that means there's going to need to be like a ton of exposition, which there is in the episode, right?
What if I told you 30 of those 40 minutes were three people sitting at a desk?
Yeah, well, certainly there is a ton of exposition, right? But the screenwriting crime I was referring to is introducing a character at this late stage in the game. In general, it's not a good idea. It definitely has happened many times in the past in like movies and stuff like that. And like many movies you can list off that like in the not only the final act but the final like 20 minutes or 30 minutes introduces a major character that has a huge bearing on the plot. But the problem is, like, you're introducing new characters at this point when you should be wrapping up and or further developing the characters that already exist, which, in my opinion, have gotten a little bit short shrifted during the course of the show, right?
I
So,
agree.
so that's the ultimate tension, is the introduction of He Who Remains, Jonathan Major's character, whatever you want to refer to him as. Let's just call him Krang for the
No,
sake
I'm
of
not
argument.
doing that.
The introduction of this character is it's a great intro. It sets it up wonderfully for like what is to come, but ultimately it takes away a huge amount of time away from these other characters who I think, like I said, were like somewhat thinly developed. Like, remember, like it was only like 3-4 episodes ago that Sylvie was set up as like the ultimate badass who's like straight up murdering people left and right. And then like we've already had like whipsawed and come around on her as like, oh, she's doing it because she has to, and she's actually nice, and also Loki's kind of in love with her. Like all this stuff has happened, and so it's already been so compressed in such a short period of time.
Right.
Like it's already so compressed. The characters in the script need this precious time to breathe that is not given to them. And now, like, we're introducing a whole other character, and like all this time is taken away from them, just from a screen time basis. Um,
It's so funny that I feel about this show the opposite of how I felt about the Netflix shows, which is like those shows were the
yeah,
12 or 13 episodes, and I
you're
felt like
talking
they
about
could have been
Daredevil or
3 or
Jessica
4.
Jones or whatever, right? Yeah,
Yeah, and now these I want to have those 8 or 9 or 10 episodes so
right.
that these things can breathe a little bit more. Um, I agree with you on all of these things. But I actually think that the Kang or He Who Remains stuff, it so almost works because yes, it's a lot of telling and not showing. And I would love to have seen, and like some alternate Kangs doing something really terrible so that we understood what the threat is and we don't just have to
Right.
believe this guy we just
Yeah.
met. Um, but the performance is so captivating. You instantly believe everything this guy tells you about the threat that is being presented. Jonathan Majors, right, is
Yeah.
the actor. I haven't seen Lovecraft Country, so this was my first real introduction to him, and I could watch this guy play the thousands of Loki or thousands of Kangs we're likely to get. Um, as this MCU, or are we call
Yeah.
it the
He
MC? Are
just
we
got
calling it the MCM now?
he just got nominated. Oh, the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse.
Yeah.
He just got nominated for his work in Lovecraft Country, so he's very good at that. He was also in the last Black Man in San Francisco, um, which he was very good in as well. One of the most talented actors of our age, and I agree with you. If he was not as good as he is, I think the episode would not work at all. Right? Like
And
I
I
don't.
think that that takes some faith from the filmmakers to
Yeah.
put so much of that in his hands.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is like, yeah, because you're really relying on this character and his character, like, because you know so little about him in this
Right.
episode, right? So you're really relying on the performance to really bring it. It's not on the page. Is the problem with this? But
I do
he
think
does
that the
deliver.
writing is smart, though.
Okay, let's talk about. Let's say more about that.
Well, I think that the way that they establish the threat and the stakes through his dialogue, not just the performance, is smart. The idea of this kind of morphing liquid thing, and
Yeah,
the
similar to like it reminded me of the Guardians of the Galaxy 2 Kurt Russell
yeah.
diorama thing. I don't know if it was. I don't remember that being liquidy, but I don't know. That was the vibe I got watching it. Yeah,
Yeah.
but
I just felt like the construction of it. I mean, once we got to the more kind of like longer scene where he allowed to do his whole thing, and get into it, like it establishes a really, I mean, you can see how throughout the show and especially in this episode, it's established a really crystal clear language for how this all works. Something that could be completely indecipherable is really quite understandable. Um, I know that like shows like Rick and Morty can blaze through ideas way fat like of this complexity a bit faster than this, but I don't think that they land with quite such. I mean, Rick and Morty's a comedy show, but um this really landed with some kind of real stakes to it because they laid it out so well. So I think on the page I really want to credit the writers for the work they've been doing up to this point to make this scene make as much sense as it does. um Even just the visual of, as I guessed last week and was right about this week, the timeline being visually on the horizon behind him. Just the construction of the whole thing is really something I think that needs to be, uh, you know, applauded, because it really is quite the setup that they've got here. Just a man behind a desk can be so interesting. It's such
mm-hmm.
a minimalistic scenario. And anyway, I just wanted to shout out like not only the design but also I think the writing does supplement his performance.
Let's talk about some of the things that actually happen in the episode. Right, just like throw a few quick things out. First of all, I'm always a fan of them messing around with the Marvel Studios logo, as people know, and I basically you heard during the Marvel Studios intro like major sounds from major moments throughout the MCU, and then you started hearing sound effects and voice clips from actual like Earth history, like real life Earth history, right? So I think like Malala was in there.
Yeah,
Yusufazi, or Yusufzai, I should say.
Yusuf Zai. Yeah,
Yusufzai, yeah, and like other famous people of note were like in the opening credits and the opening, Marvel Studios logo, and I thought that was pretty cool. And I think visually, the whole design of the castle is really interesting. Like, there's basically like, for lack of a better word, it's like the walls are like painted with these like slashes that I think are supposed to indicate kind of branching timelines, or the sacred timeline and the possibility of branching. It was the sense I got. Does that jive with you?
yeah, or like something that was pieced back together
Right. Yeah.
in some way. Like I'm thinking maybe like after the first multiversal war, like the castle was reassembled in some way, and you have some things that are not like there's like a broken statue in the room with the timekeepers, and one can imagine that perhaps that's like King the Conqueror statue that was destroyed. There's a lot to kind of like pick apart there.
A lot of people saying in the chat that the opening made them think of the movie Contact, which is a great
Yeah.
call out. That it's a movie that also begins with like pulling back and seeing context of the planets, and also culturally significant sound effects. So
I mean, it's interesting that we're getting these real world figures. I mean, between this and Black Widow, which had like the Clintons show up and the opening credits, over it is weird to see these characters from the real world show up in Marvel films, which is not something I think has really happened all that much.
yeah. So then Miss Minutes shows up, and like I guess it's now clear that like Miss Minutes is not just some AI, like she actually theoretically has sentience, maybe. And it makes them an offer like, hey, how would you like to actually rule the universe together? Like you can have the Infinity Gauntlet, you can win the Battle of New York, all these things. And I think that this is one of the emotional key moments of the show, is you need to believe that Loki has learned enough that he is willing to say no, and or that he is able to determine that what she's offering is not a real offer, which is, I guess, where they end up. But like he kind of rejects this offer, right? In earnest was my sense.
Yeah,
Uh,
she's basically Slugworth at the end of Willy Wonka, like offering money for the everlasting gobstopper,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and like she's like the last test before, you know, uh, Jonathan Majors, who actually has some serious Willy Wonka
The
energy.
whole thing is very Willy Wonka esque, right? Like you've made it to the
Yeah,
last level, and now you get to take over and run the whole thing, right?
right. Yeah,
So
yeah. So did you buy this moment where he kind of brushes off her offer?
I think for me, I would say that I would give this finale kind of overall a 7 to 7.5 out of 10, which I would actually say is like very good. Like it's solid. Like it's hard to land a show like this at all, and so I think
Right.
it's solid. But like I just think they took a lot of shortcuts with the storytelling, right? And it's like, okay, do I even believe that this is a legit? They're changing the fabric of reality on such a frequent basis in this show that I wasn't even sure it was a legitimate offer, right? Because I'm like, is it legitimate? Could be. I have no. I don't know. Like just an episode ago, like we found out that you don't get killed when you get pruned. Like, and
Right.
now that's new information. And so is Miss Minutes actually making an offer? I think the show thinks we are supposed to believe that it's a lie, but I'm like, I have no idea. Maybe this person is making that offer. Like, why wouldn't they? Like, so I think that if we are to believe that it is a real offer, my interpretation is we're supposed to believe it's a real offer, and that Loki has learned enough that he's willing to turn it down. Like he has theoretically been so moved by this entire thing that he's been through that he is going to turn down this offer because he knows that pursuing his old ways of selfishness and domination and what have you have led him to a bad place, and he no longer wants to be there.
And they always end up with him dead, right? Like
Yeah.
the previous Lokis have said, like they never let us have free will. We're always determined to go down this one path. Um,
Right. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, like, I believed in that moment that Loki would make that choice, but barely. But barely. So it worked for me, but I'm like, ooh, I really wish I had a little bit more, character development, for this character that's making this critical decision at this moment. That's me. I'll say overall it worked, and then we're off to the races with all this other stuff, right?
yeah,
So
it worked for me, but it's done with such little flourish. It's not presented in a way so as to make you think that this is a real offer, like you said.
right,
You know,
exactly.
like
And there's a moment later on in the episode where Loki's like, "Hey, can we just think about this decision that's going to impact the fate of the universe for like 60 seconds?" And Sylvie is like, "No, like let's keep fighting, and I'm going to kill this guy." And it to me felt like this very meta moment about the show. Like, can we please just sit and think about this for 60 seconds, like this major decision? But it's like, nope, we got to get on to the new exposition and the new fight scene and the new blah blah blah. Yeah.
I
So
like that moment, and we'll get to that in a minute. But like, I could see an alternate version of this scene that we're discussing, where like Loki is presented with his like horned helm and like the Infinity Gauntlet with all the gems in it, you know. And we've already seen that people are using those as paperweights. So like when they present these things to him, now he's like, well, they actually have no meaning to me
mm-hmm.
anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there had to be a better visual way of communicating the importance of this moment, and then seeing him like, you know, discard these things because they've done the work to set that up. You know, you set up the Infinity Gems in the drawer, like present them to him again, and have him realize, actually, no, like there's a grander power than this, which is my own free will,
Yeah.
and cast them aside. I think it's like halfway there. The beat is right, the presentation of it is wrong.
Yeah, Watermelon Heart in the chat says it felt almost rushed. I needed another couple beats of Loki struggling to decide or think about it.
Right. I,
Uh,
I think about like Indiana Jones at the end of like Last Crusade, where he's reaching out for the
yes,
Grail,
great
and
example.
like he could fall down the thing but turns back. You know, give me some idea
Yeah,
that he's struggling with the decision.
right. Like, what is Loki really feeling in that moment? Is he like, oh man, I could have all I wanted, or is he this? Is he thinking Miss Minutes is full of BS? Which
Right.
kind of unclear if that's the case and which one's more satisfying. I think it's more satisfying if he's actually considering the offer, right?
Right.
But anyway, so they go to Kang, and like, we can talk about what happens with Ravonna and or Ravonna. Is it Ravonna?
It's Ravona.
Yeah, Ravonna and Mobius later on. But they go to and I will say, like, I really thought that the moment when Miss Minutes kind of like starts walking them through the stuff is really haunting. She's like, congratulations, you made it. Like, you're gonna like, he is very impressed, and they're like, who's he? And he's like, he who remains. And that's just like a really creepy, unsettling way to describe anyone. I think it's from the comics. Is that right, Dan Gvozden?
Right. Yeah. He Who Remains is actually a different character in the comics, and some people were suspecting that he would be the guy that is in the Citadel. It's a completely different character that has nothing to do with Kang, and
Yeah.
so like, you know, I'm sure some people will say, "Oh, Dan, well, actually, this is He Who Remains, not Kang," although it is Kang. This character is introduced in Thor number 245, and he was like I think I mentioned this in an earlier discussion we had. He was the like the head of the TVA, the last of the Time Twisters from the previous universe that predated the one that we're in now, and he like passed through the, I guess, the death and the birth of a new universe, the Time Twisters, who would birth the new TVA. So in the comics, he was introduced just as like a guy that lives at the end of time, and then later they would kind of retcon him into being linked with the TVA in a book called Avengers Forever #9. Um, but you know, I never thought that it was going to be that guy because he's so obscure in the comics.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, it makes sense here, like what they did with Sylvie, where they combine characters together. So they gave them the name,
Yeah.
but he is in form Kang.
The Vicious Ocean, who's being a little bit Snippy in the comments, I have to say, has pointed out, why would they consider the offer after getting that far? Seems like a no-brain decision. I mean, I think this is a pretty good point. The only thing I would say in response to it is, the one thing that actually this whole situation reminds me of is the Matrix, right? With Cypher and the Matrix, basically there's some people who take the red pill, some people who take the blue pill. Like some people are like, I want to break free of this thing. And some people are like, just plug me back in and give me all, like, make me famous and act like an actor and give me lots of money. And they're happy with that, right? And I do think we are meant to see some kind of struggle with Loki in that, like that theoretically does tug on him a little bit because he has worked so hard in every single movie we've seen him in to achieve dominance in the reality that we previously know. But I agree that ultimately, at the end of the day, it is a question. Like, they want to destroy the guy in charge because they want free will, truly, right? Like because if Kang the Conqueror knows what's happening, I'm calling him that now, Dan Gvozden.
Yes.
Then there is no such thing as free will. Everything's already predetermined. That's actually a point that Kang the Conqueror makes.
I mean,
Um,
Loki also says like we write our own destiny now. Like that's his goal, at this point in the show, right? Like he wants to go this far so that he can achieve the free will he's always been talking about.
yeah.
Um,
So they meet the Conqueror, He Who Remains, and then he kind of explains everything that happened, which is like there were different versions of him, and they interacted with each other, and then there was a big multiversal war, and then in order to stop that, he had to prune all the timelines. Right now, there's only like one Grandmaster timeline.
can I ask you a question? What was your feeling when that elevator door opened and you saw him there and then we're introduced to this guy for the first time? Because it's a very interesting performance and characterization of this particular character. I'm curious what you, who know nothing about Kang other than what maybe I've told you erroneously on the show, um, what your reaction was to just
My
seeing the
first
doors
reaction
open.
was Dan. I'm not joking. My first reaction was Dan Gvozden called it. I'm not even exaggerating. I was like, Dan called it. Good for him. That's amazing. And then my second reaction was, wow, this is like a really interesting characterization. He's clearly having fun with it, but it's not so over the top that it's goofy, in my opinion. I think he really
Hmm.
walks a good line. So, anyway, yeah, that was my reaction. What was your reaction, Dan Gvozden? Is that when you
Well,
started
I got
clapping?
really excited that I called it, but then after that subsided, which took a while to subside, I'll be honest. Not that I'm the only person on the internet that's called this, although
Uh
I,
huh.
I did stake my claim early.
Uh huh.
Um, uh, I mean, it's a kind of a goofy performance, but it's the kind of like swagger someone who knows everything
Right.
and isn't worried about anything would have.
Yeah.
And Kang's kind of portrayal in the comics has been very varied over the years because in the comics every time Kang travels through time he creates a duplicate of himself, and so they all have very different personalities. So sometimes you will get a very silly Kang. Writer Mark Waid in his more recent Avengers run had a kind of silly Kang who was behind a lot of this stuff and was like acted like this. And so I'm very interested to like kind of catalog as more of these characters inevitably show up, like how he's performing it, and I really enjoyed it, but it definitely caught me off guard.
So he kind of lays out all the stuff that happened. He weaponized Goliath, had it eat. He had Goliath eat the other universes, is my understanding, right? That's the thing that we saw, the creature we saw last episode.
Correct,
Um,
yeah.
and also in the show notes here, you identify Avengers issue 267. What is the significance of that issue, Dan?
Yeah, well, so Kang goes into detail in this, or He Who Remains goes into detail in this show about all of these different versions of himself that he's terrified of, and how they came together to try to make like the universe better, but then ultimately ended up fighting and causing this multiversal war. And in the comics, starting in Avengers 267, there is this group called the Council of Cross-Time Kangs, and this is like a group of all of these variant Kangs that create this kind of multiversal council where they can rule over and
Like the
and
Citadel of
eventually
Ricks,
fight.
basically.
Right, the Citadel of Ricks is based
Yeah,
off of this
yeah.
um, this concept, and there would ultimately be like a council of Reed Richards, of all the Mister Fantastics that got together and used their intellect to try to uh, help the universe until they were ultimately proven to be evil, which we could get as well because we're going to get a Fantastic Four movie, and I imagine that if they're going to do a council of or discuss a council of cross time Kangs, they might do the Council of Reeds. But if you are interested in learning more about this council that Kang talks about, it's introduced in Avengers number 267.
All right, great call out. So essentially, what He Who Remains offers them is one of two options, right? They can assume the throne and take over, right? Or they can murder He Who Remains, at which point other Kangs will then theoretically uh, take over or fight for supremacy to try to dominate the timeline. Is
Right.
that
For
a good? Yeah.
every split of the timeline creates a universe where a Kang could possibly exist.
Right.
And he has been pruning it just to prevent his own appearances. Um, and I wonder if that's also why Loki, like, obviously he's assuming that Loki's will get to him and replace him potentially. So he must see that Loki's are equally possible of being as powerful as himself, which could be part of why he's pruning the Loki specifically, or using the TVA to specifically go after Loki's, um, and ultimately waiting for the one dedicated enough to get all the way to him. Uh, but yeah, he's pruning the world of alternate Kangs so as to prevent another multiversal war. But I guess he just got tired of doing that after a while.
Right. He's like pruning timelines is a young man's game, basically. Like I'm done. I'm
Yeah,
done with the pruning.
yeah,
I've had enough of pruning. Happy for you folks to take over. A hand-to-hand fight ensues because Sylvie, and I think the hand-to-hand combat has been like overall fairly silly and unnecessary throughout the whole series. Uh, Although it was not bad in this episode, and then the tension there is, I guess Sylvie really wants to murder this guy real quick, and Loki's like, let's take a second to think about it. And then also they throw in the Conqueror sprinkles in a little bit. Oh my gosh, the timeline's starting to split right now. Like you got to decide, So like all these kind of contrivances to like make there be some time some suspense, I should say. And then the conclusion, right, is Loki surrenders uh, and kind of acknowledges his feelings for Sylvie. They kiss, and then she betrays him. Basically, she's like, you know, she doesn't feel the same way about him because she wants to do what she wants to do, which is burn this whole thing down, right? Destroy the people who have robbed her of her childhood and her life
right.
by trying to get rid of her. And so this is the second big emotional beat of the episode, out of maybe 3 or 4 big emotional beats. And I'm curious how this worked for you. Like when you saw Sylvie push Loki back through a temporal gate or whatever it's called, what was your reaction?
Well, I actually think this whole sequence is really exciting. This was like one of the first like actual like fisticuff battles, if you will, that really I felt like an emotional charge behind, and I thought it was really exciting, and I liked the ticking clock of the timeline splitting and them having to make a quick decision on what they're going to do. That stuff all worked for me. My problem isn't really with Sylvie at all. I understand her motivations completely. She wants revenge, and that makes sense to me, and she wants free will, free of the TVA and the constraints of the timeline. Um, that would allow her to continue her mischief, and that's who she is. She's a Loki, and that's what Lokis do. Um, that all made sense to me. My one problem with this, and I think this is my big problem with the episode, is I know that Loki says in the previous scene with Miss Minutes, he says, we're going to determine our own destiny now. But then here, when he takes up swords against or knives against Sylvie, I'm not really sure why he feels so strongly in the opposite from
Hmm.
her. Why
Well,
he
this
feels the
is
need
this
to protect
again. This is a
King.
contrivance, right? He doesn't feel so strongly. He's just like, let's think about it for a second. That's what he keeps saying repeatedly during the fight.
Yeah, I mean, and he also says like, I'm not interested in the throne. I'm interested in like you being okay.
Yes.
And to me, that's like a it's like a half measure to making sense for me. Like, oh, I understand. Okay, so he doesn't want to kill Kang because then that will create infinite Kangs, which will then, in that essence, put them all in great danger. But it's not enough for me to think that Loki sides on the side of determinism versus free will, which I think is like ultimately where the show kind of wants us to think that he kind of landed.
Hmm.
And you're right, it's a bit of a contrivance, and I think it like undersells the themes of the show to kind of put him in that place. And I think they could have definitely earned it, but he just kind of seems to back down, and I don't know why. And I'm willing to buy it, but it like that's the one kind of sour note for me that made me go, I don't know why this ended up this way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
In order to generate tension, you need to have these two kind of be diametrically opposed in some way. But the problem is that you can't have Loki be so opposed to killing this guy, right? Like Loki has been interested in killing this guy since early on. And so I think it's kind of like you said, a half measure where they can't have Loki not not want to kill this guy and Sylvie want to kill this guy because that doesn't make sense for Loki's character. So the way they're gonna solve that is they're gonna make Loki more interested in Sylvie than in the throne. That is kind of their solution from a storytelling perspective. And your mileage may vary as to how well that worked.
I also just don't think it's true of Loki. I'm often reminded of comics editor Tom Brevoort, who works at Marvel and is like a major like head of like overseeing Avengers and things. And he said, if you can easily replace your story's hero with any other hero, you have work to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like Loki's actions here are the actions of a different person.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't see this as like a Loki moment. And for a show called Loki that kind of abandoned its main character for everybody else in the end, it's a bit disappointing because like I think a lot of people are going to point at Kang and his appearance as the real problem in this episode,
Yeah.
like that. But I actually don't necessarily think it is. I think he presents a really interesting question for these characters to answer. I just don't know that I understand Loki's answer. And that's where I would really point my finger at going, huh, that's a little bit disappointing.
Okay, and what do you conceive of Loki's answer that you don't understand? Just so we're clear.
But why he abandons his desire
He's
to
he's opposed to
chase free
killing.
will.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's opposed to killing the Conqueror. Um,
I mean, it's not even just killing. It's like it's a choice between like anarchy and authoritarianism. And I just
mhm.
don't see Loki ever siding on. I guess maybe I could see him siding on authoritarianism in some version of himself, but
Well,
I
I
think
mean,
we're
I,
meant to believe that he's evolving as a character.
right. I mean, remember, in Avengers when he made everyone like bow down before him. He was
Right.
really into it at that point, right?
I guess he does say here, like, I'm not after the throne. I'm after like making sure that you're okay. I guess I just don't know what
That is
you being
theoretically
okay is what that means.
right. That's theoretically like a critical moment, like for him to say, "I'm not after the throne." So again, go back to my earlier thing, right? Like you, it is supposed to be a major kind of emotional arc for this character that you believe he is willing to put his old pursuits behind him, right? And I think overall, it kind of works. I have similar reservations and issues to you, so I don't think it's a home run. But it's like I said, it's solid. It's decent. It's a
It's
good and
solid.
it's good. It's like pretty good. It's not amazing, but even landing something that's pretty good is like a huge accomplishment for something this complicated with this many moving parts.
Yeah, and I
But
think it's easily forgiven for the sequence that follows.
okay, so well, first of all, one last thing. There is a fight, and then Loki asks, "Why aren't you seeing this the same way? Because you can't trust, and I can't be trusted." You highlighted this line in the show notes. Scott Hendelman in the chat highlighted this line as well. Like, why is this line significant to you?
Well, it's supposed to be kind of like outlining like one the divergence between the two characters, um, and it's supposed to kind of outline like all why the decisions that they made are what they made. She can't trust anybody else, so she wants to kind of destroy it and give himself free will, and he can't be trusted. But like, I don't really see why our Loki can't be trusted. Like for a show about Loki, the god of mischief. I really think he hasn't gotten up to all that much mischief outside of the first few episodes. He's kind of
Hmm.
been a passenger along for the ride. I
Yeah.
haven't felt him like being a real trickster. And so to me, that line rang a little bit hollow. It's trading on our knowledge of Loki. But again, I feel like they've like spent so much of the show trying to convince us otherwise, that Loki has grown up and changed, only for us to then kind of rely on our old feelings about Loki. And maybe he was saying that not entirely honestly. He's relying on who they used to be. But I don't know. That line kind of rang hollow to me as well.
Yeah. Uh, so Jim McMahon brings up a good point in the chat, by the way. He says, I think considering what Loki said at the end, it's more about him being terrified of an evil Kang. They couldn't even touch the nice Kang who didn't want to hurt them. I think that's a great point. Like they can't touch Kang, and it's like he's like, what if the next person's worse than this Kang, and we can't even hurt this Kang, right? Like the next Kang's gonna be unstoppable, basically. So, what do you think of that, Dan Gvozden?
Sure, but they still have that option, right? Like they could take his place and continue to prune the timeline. So
Right.
they have the tools to do so at their disposal. So the fear of alternate Kangs is not really something that factors in, so long as they want that and free will, right?
Well, I
But
think, yeah,
even
I
then, it's
think
a
you're
little
meant to
bit
believe like they don't want to be under the oppression of this timekeeper system, and therefore they do not want to be complicit in it. That's the leap that I was able to make. But I
yeah.
agree that the show does not like super spell that out, in my opinion. You know what I mean?
I mean, the show takes pains to say like there is no free will except for the man at the top,
Yeah.
right? But if they're going to be the new people at the top,
Right.
then they have free will,
Yeah.
right? So
But
then they're going to
again,
want to free it for everybody else. But I don't know that I have been completely sold on that. Maybe for Mobius and stuff, but yeah.
let's talk briefly about the Mobius storyline. So first of all, we find out where the significance of that pencil, right, that we saw in the earlier episode. It was Ravona's. It was from Ravona's high school, I guess, because she was like a high school teacher or whatever. And that was B-15's plan. Is they're gonna bring people to Earth to see Ravona before she became a huge higher up at the TVA, and then by seeing her, all the people at the TVA will say, "Oh my gosh, we really are variants, and I know this now because I've seen Ravona in this completely different environment. Therefore, I will believe you, Winmi Masaku, and we're gonna form a band together and not be against each other anymore." Did I capture that relatively acceptably?
I didn't get any of that, but I believe you that that's correct. I don't know. Like I honestly didn't really know what the
Mm.
aim of that scene was.
Dan, you
So
you are every episode we talk. This is like you have the most intricate understanding of like every single character and how they relate with each other, and every offhanded reference. Meanwhile, I'm asking you basic plot details of what's going on in this show. You're like, what?
I mean, I didn't know that that was explicitly her plan.
I don't know if it was like they gave this plot line such short shrift at the end there when Gugu Mbatha-Raw, who plays Ravonna, was like giving a soliloquy about like, here's where I'm off to. It just was like, wow, this plot line really wrapped up real quick. That was kind of my reaction. What did you think?
Well, I felt the same way. I just didn't know what it meant that we discovered her, whether it's a variant or whether that is her in the Marvel Universe Prime, if
Oh
you
yeah, yeah,
will.
yeah, yeah. Because theoretically, TVA folks are variants, right? So like,
Right.
so
And this
maybe
is
that was a variant version of her that then got taken to the TVA, right?
yeah, I mean, we know the one in the TVA is a variant. So this woman that we're seeing, who's like at this school, or she's like a judge,
Right.
she is the one that's in the Marvel Universe Prime because this is before the timeline split. So
Yeah.
this is the version of her that it would exist alongside all the characters we've known thus far. And it is interesting that she's got like posters on her wall that are similar to the ones in the TVA, so that she's still kind of the same person.
Right.
But I guess I didn't
And she
really
brought and
know
she brought
where
all
this was
her
going.
stencil, her stationery as well.
Yeah, of course,
Uh,
very important.
really weird that they would let them keep their stationery from the old world. Feels like that could lead to people investigating their past and such. Slipstream in the chat says it made no sense. They didn't think that the TVA variations wouldn't run into themselves ever. I mean, it's a good
Yeah,
question.
yeah, I don't really get it. And you know, all the goings on between like Ravana and Mobius, I'm a little bit confused by too. I mean, they have this whole discussion of like free will versus chaos, and that all made sense to me. Like Mobius is turning his back on the TVA, and he is seeking free will again. And gosh darn it, we didn't get our Mobius on a jet ski yet, but there's still season two.
Yeah.
And she believes in like authoritarian rule, and that there's like a purpose to it all, right? Which ultimately she's pretty much right about. Um, but then like when she like knocks down Mobius, who does not have get a good fight scene, and gets his
The,
pruning device.
it was the saddest fight scene ever. He's like, I'm gonna take, and he just like sticks his arm out, and then she just like, she just knocks him over so easily. It's so bad. Yeah.
She like summons a time door, and he says like, "Where are you going?" And she's like, "To find free will." And I guess the implication there, I thought it was a really weird line.
It's the
Um,
her whole dialogue. I thought was extremely stilted overall.
very stilted
Yeah,
overall.
yeah,
There's a character that is very underwritten,
yeah.
or whatever. Um, uh, I don't think she's interested in free will. She just said she wasn't. So like the implication for that to me reads as she's going to find the one who remains. Like she's interested in whoever is um behind all of it, because if that person has free will, she can learn a little bit more about what's going on. Combine that with Miss Minutes gives her like a tempad earlier on in the
Yeah.
episode and says like he thinks this would be more helpful to you. And you're like, wait, what? Who is he? We know that he is probably the one who remains,
Yeah.
but I actually don't think that that's what's going on. I think that he is in reference to Kang the Conqueror, not the one who remains. I think Ravana heads off somewhere completely different. This is me theorizing again, and I don't feel as confident about this, but she doesn't show up at the Citadel at the end of time, right? And that guy is already dead. But when we come back from all that, we see this Kang statue in the TVA. I wonder if she got the actual location to maybe a surviving Kang that is hiding somewhere in the Marvel universe. And I specifically think they might be hiding in the quantum realm, in Chronopolis, that little city that you can see in Ant-Man and the Wasp, that I referenced last episode. I think she's headed somewhere completely different. and there's like something else going on.
All right. Well, Dan, I would not doubt you because you've been right about a lot of things. So
Does that make any sense to you, what I just said?
it doesn't not make sense. I'll put it
Okay.
that way. I actually have the script from the episode. Mobius asks, "Where are you going to go?" She says, "In search of free will. I understand your moral objections to what the TVA does, and my methods are deceptive, but the mission, it never was. Without me, without the TVA, everything burns." Which I thought was kind of interesting. You know, and that's something, again, I think the show is very good at. And I'm not even saying this is an insult, which is like, it's good at like raising these issues, right? Of like, what if you believe that everything you discovered that everything you believed was based on lies, but you fundamentally still believed that the infrastructure, the institution, whatever, was still a force for good in the world. Like, is it worth then continuing? And Ravona has given her answer for it, but yeah, you know, it's an interesting concept. So
But I mean, what does it mean still that she's looking for free will in that? Like
I
she,
have
like,
no idea.
yeah,
I think it's just teasing for future stuff, right? And
yeah,
you've made a
exactly.
prediction as to what that is, and it's certainly way better than any prediction I could make. So
Okay.
all right. So you already indicated that actually the ending of this show is pretty cool. Uh, Loki gets back to the TVA, and he's trying to find Mobius to like tell him what's going on because there's like Nexus events splitting off left and right. And Mobius, in a rather shocking moment, does not recognize Loki. And that's when Loki says, like, sees a statue of He Who Remains, the Conqueror. You know, I'm trying not to refer to him as Kang. Uh, I'm not trying to annoy you, Dan, but I'm actually leaving open the possibility that like
It's not Kang.
he might be named something. They might change his name later. He might be named something else. I don't know. You're probably right, because when the casting news was announced, it was Jonathan Majors is Kang the Conqueror. But
Right.
don't you think it's weird that they don't say the name Kang ever? Like, I'm like, what? Why would they withhold that unless there was some purpose for it? You know what I mean?
I think it's because maybe they want to distinguish the characters easier for the audience by not calling them Kang and calling the next one Kang.
I see.
Um, you
Okay.
know, the more
Like calling Loki's variant Sylvie. Like that's why,
right.
because it'd be confusing if you had to call them Loki 2 and Loki 1 or whatever, right? Yeah.
Right. And the one at the end, the statue has the more kind of like formal Kang the Conqueror attire from the comics.
Mm-hmm.
The one in the Citadel, um I won't go too deep into this, but Kang has like several different versions of himself, including like uh Rama Tut, who was this like ruler in Egypt and stuff, and Immortus, who is like an old immortal man that like ruled the 31st century. And I won't go into that, but I do think that they're going to split up these different personas of Kang in an interesting way. And I think the one we see here at the end is like the formal Kang the Conqueror.
Mm, mm.
Whereas the guy before, right, is this guy they're calling, the one who remains.
So so this is a genuinely shocking moment. It's upsetting when you've seen Mobius and Loki kind of be buddy buddy, and then Mobius doesn't recognize Loki. Like, that's just like a viscerally upsetting thing to witness, right? So I really enjoyed that moment. Uh, I don't know if I finished my point from earlier, Dan Gvozden, about like if you expect what this show is going to give you, you will have a good time. If you are expecting it to be completely self-contained, tightly told narrative, you will have a somewhat good time and possibly a somewhat bad time as well, right? Does that make am I making sense so far?
Absolutely. I
Yeah,
have a list here of remaining questions that I have,
right.
that
But
I hope will return in season two. Yeah.
I think that, right. Imagine there's another version of this story. Like, what Loki does is it upends everything we understood about time in the MCU until this point, right? Like, underneath the reality that's permeated every MCU movie, there's been this other reality of stuff happening that was run by this guy, He Who Remains. And this show could have been about that. Like, it could have been about Loki learning more about himself and figuring out more about his relationship with Sylvie and all that stuff, and finding out who he truly is with the knowledge of the future and all that stuff that brings. That itself could have been a very satisfying storyline, right?
Mhm.
The problem from a script perspective with this He Who Remains Conqueror reveal is it then, in some ways, it doesn't upend what we've seen before, because somebody in the chat actually pointed out quite aptly that very few of the rules that were laid out earlier on are actually broken, but it completely reorients the why. And also to some degree, yes, the how, because there are no timekeepers, right? It's this one dude at the end of time. And so I think, like, there's this thing in movies called, like, a reversal, where, like, oh, everything you believed is actually a lie. He was dead the whole time. And I felt like the show already did that to begin with. That was the premise. And then the final episode does another reversal again with, like, a little cherry twist on top. And thereby the final episode becomes way more plot driven and exposition driven than character driven, right? Like, so much of this final episode is, we're introducing who the Conqueror is, we're explaining what his whole backstory is, and by the way, now, like, at the end of time, everything we've just known, like, has been building this whole show up, has been ripped up and, like, reassembled again in a different way. And oh, by the way, we're going to sneak some character development in there too.
But don't you think, like, something doesn't have to be perfect to also be kind of genius? Like, I can recognize its faults. It doesn't entirely work for me, but at the same time, like, watching that sequence of the, like, timeline exploding into
I mean, it is
the
cool.
multiverse of madness, it's
cool.
like, what a magic trick they've pulled off. Like what other 25th iteration in a series has tried something like this? I can't think of it. Like, I do think the MCU is truly unique amongst, like, major mainstream entertainment like of its type. I mean, I'll just say this, like, again, for all the faults that I had with this episode, like, to go from watching Black Widow last week to watching this.
Oh, I feel like we might have lost. Oh, Dan, you there? We lost you for a second.
Yeah, I'm here.
We lost you
for
a
you
second.
lost me for a second.
To go from Black Widow to this, you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think it's amazing what they can pull off. It might not all be perfect, but just the spectrum of, like, these things that can coexist, I think it's really stunning.
I think you're right that, like, they are leaving it all on the field, right? They're not. You could see a scenario where they rest on their laurels. They're like, oh, we've built this amazing cinematic universe. Let's just keep making new origin stories, and the guys go on different adventures and so on. Like, they could do that. But they're going for it. They're making big swings, and it doesn't necessarily connect all the way for me, but they are, like, ripping up the foundation of this thing and reassembling it again in different and interesting ways. And I do admire them for that. So I agree with the overall sentiment of what you said.
I don't want to be the guy that's like, they didn't have to look at the gift they're giving us. Like, that's just not how I approach this kind of thing. But at the same time, I, like, watch something like this and I'm like, like, that took serious balls to even attempt this.
Yeah.
Like, they didn't need, like you said, it could have been a show just about these two characters. Like, I appreciate just the gall to go, oh, we're going to completely flip this, on its head in some way.
Yeah.
So, it might be like they went for a moonshot and didn't quite get there, but, like, I appreciate the attempt.
All right. We are going to talk about remaining questions that are left over. Also, if you have any questions in the chat, let us know. This is our biggest audience yet, by the way, Dan. We got, like, about 200 people in the chat right now. So
who knew 1:10 a.m. in the morning would be the popular time for me.
If you want to hear a high quality audio podcast version of this episode of this recap show and support my work. Help me make more of this kind of thing. Patreon.com/DaveChen is where you want to go. Also, check out Dan's podcast at AmazingSpiderTalk.com. You want to hear more of Dan? AmazingSpiderTalk.com is a great place to do that.
Can I back up in terms of remaining questions to the scene that we just talked about, the end scene?
Please.
Because one of the big questions I have about Mobius not remembering who Loki is does this immediately break the time travel rules as established by the previous scene? This to me, I'm not quite sure what we're looking at. Like, was Loki tossed into a like tangent reality where they don't, they never met Loki because Kang was already ruling and it didn't matter that like they were Lokis throwing off the timeline because it was splitting like crazy. Are we meant to think that this is the main Marvel universe again and it's going by Back to the Future time travel rules?
I think it's Back to the Future time travel rules, even though in Avengers Endgame this specifically said that stuff doesn't apply. But it's a situation where Kang, like the Kang variants, if he is called that, went back in time and like reoriented the entire TVA and the purpose for it, and created a universe where Mobius and Loki never met, basically, right?
I just don't understand why that would be. Given the rules. I mean, maybe because they killed him at the end of
what
time.
specifically would be? Would
why would it go backwards on the timeline? Like we've established that time is kind of like fixed in some way and always moves forward. That was the rule established by Avengers Endgame, and I think it's been fairly consistent here. Your actions don't influence things like in the future. That's why they could go hide in the apocalypses and know that they weren't creating new tangents because they, if they made a change, it created a tangent, not that like, and that's the whole point of the thread splintering, I don't know why we would return to the main world and they would forget. Wouldn't that just be a tangent?
Yeah, I mean, there's people in the chat that are also raising similar questions. Like Jay Albor says, wouldn't another TVA imply that the TVA is in our specific timeline and our Kang is only protecting this timeline and there aren't any other timelines? Yeah, like, the point being brought up by people in the chat is like, isn't the TVA theoretically like outside the influence of, branching timelines, right? They are in a position to observe branching timelines, but like, they're not part of a timeline in any conventional way. That's why like variants don't age and stuff like that. I guess I don't feel like it's worth spending that much time thinking about this,
right?
Because
it's supposed to be a WTF
right.
moment.
We do not have enough information to actually answer the question. So like I just don't want to even spend time on it.
All right. Well then moving on.
Yeah. Okay, so remaining questions. What is the next? I'm just gonna read from here. Like you've written this down. Do you want to read them, or do you want me to read them?
Yeah, sure, I can read them.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, what is the Nexus event between the two Lokis, and how did that work? Right, we know that they like held hands, and it created this Nexus event. But then in this episode, we're told by He Who Remains that it was all predetermined. So if it was predetermined, why did that create a Nexus event?
Good question. I don't think we're ever gonna get an answer to that question, but that's.
I mean,
that's
my like, if I'm gonna like no prize it and come up with an answer for myself, it's that like I think that their romance is what ultimately would have led them to Kang, right? And this was the start of that. So, it created this moment that like signified them as the ones that would eventually get to He Who Remains. But wouldn't that create a divergent path on the timeline? And that now I'm making myself go cross-eyed. But yeah. Anyway, it's a bad answer to my own question, but it doesn't make sense to me that like these two things are simultaneous. It's all predetermined, and their actions created I don't know. Anyway, sorry.
It's okay. Other remaining questions. Who is the other person who has worked for Ravonna? So she looks at the coffee cup like stains on the table, right? And theoretically, we're supposed to think, oh, there's another person that's not Mobius that's very important to this, right? Was that your
Right,
interpretation of
and
it?
we saw it in like last week's recap, and I think she did it again in this episode, if I'm not correct. Um, and we just didn't get an answer to that.
Yeah.
I imagine it's forthcoming, but that seemed like something that we were going to get an answer to, or if it was answered, it was like answered in a way that just didn't make any sense. Um, this next one, I think I already answered on the show for myself, so I'm going to cross it off.
Uh huh.
Um, One of the things I feel like we haven't gotten is like why was Sylvie to be pruned as a child? Um, there was this idea that like she had done something that created a separate timeline, and she was to be erased from reality. Was it just her existence as
Mm-hmm.
like a female Loki? Um, that's something I feel like was kind of yada yada past. Was that your understanding? It's like just her existence was enough to get her pruned?
I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay.
That's why, but we are reading these because we don't have answers to these yet.
Right, right. This
Yeah.
next one is more to do with you. You want to take this one, Dave?
When will we see Mobius on a jet ski? I just want to say a lot of people in the chat have also been supporting my jet ski with Mobius theory that we will see that at some point. We'll see if Owen Wilson's going to be in Loki season 2.
Yeah,
It could
I
still
assume
happen.
he will. I
Could
assume he
still happen.
will.
Yeah.
One of the things that I want to know is, and I guess will be answered shortly, is, are all of the other properties associated with Marvel ones that Disney has acquired, and the Spider-Man universe with Sony, are they all going to end up being variant realities? I think the answer to that is yes, because we've got the Spider-Man No Way Home coming, and the casting announcements make it sound like we're getting variants of past Spider-Man villains. Um, but the bigger question on that is, do these variant realities work retroactively? My understanding is, and perhaps this is where it gets into the whole thing we were talking about earlier, where you were saying like it somehow created branches earlier in the timeline than the moment uh, that they like left. I don't know. I guess if they're at the end of the time, it could affect the whole timeline. But you know, are there going to be alternate realities where like Captain America didn't die, or Iron Man didn't die, or there's alternate Iron Mans, or is there like a fixed point in the Marvel universe where from that point forward the timeline started splintering,
Yeah.
and there weren't variants previous to that weren't pruned by the TVA?
Well, there is a Marvel series called What If coming up, and I
Right.
am curious if that's going to tie into this at all, right? Like,
Well, the
it,
question is that canon? Is that in the
right? Is it?
MCU?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are those actual universes, or is it just like, hey, let's do a mental exercise? Like, it'll be curious to see what the framing of What If is, right? So,
Right. We know it's like Uatu the Watcher is going to be framing it. He's a character from the What If comics.
yeah.
But yeah, that'll be interesting because like I could see them doing that to say like, hey, let's recast Iron Man and Captain America,
Mm.
and we can have our cake and eat it too. And it'll be not Tony Stark, it'll be Tony Stank or whatever. Anyway,
I hope not. I hope it's not Tony Stank.
well,
Um,
some
but
people in the chat can let Dave know what that's a reference
no,
to.
I know what it's a reference to,
Oh, it is.
Dan.
Okay, all
I
right.
I've seen the MCU movies.
Okay, great, great, great.
So what
Sorry for
else?
doubting you.
How does Wanda fit into all this? She's Nexus beings, and Nexus beings are basically able to travel through timelines unchanged, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
they're kind of like the arbiters of the timeline and stuff. And my suspicion is that she's going to be trying to prevent the timeline splitting, and
hmm
that's going to be her role. But it's interesting that we're already seeing them start to fit together. She's going to be in the Doctor Strange movie, so I suspect that she's going to play a role in stopping this further splitting, which she's obviously going to fail at, and ultimately guide us to Secret Wars, which is
hmm
where I think this is all heading. But I already asked this earlier. Are we going to stop calling it the MCU and start calling it the MCM, the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse? Um, I discussed my theory about Chronopolis earlier, and we already revisited your theory about prison. So that was all of my lingering thoughts. David, did you have any lingering questions at the end of all this?
I don't. And again, last call for questions from the chat if you want. But uh, overall, what do we make of this show, Dan Gvozden? I think as we're thinking back on season 1 of Loki, like I said, pretty solid. I wouldn't. I would say it's probably one of the best examples of this format, um, of what can be achieved with this form. A lot of people are irritated that something like this spends so much time tying into other things in the MCU. I completely understand that irritation. It is a hard limit on what can be done with these kinds of shows. And I think that's a little unfortunate. Like, it would be awesome to see something like this just be its own thing, not tie into anything else, be its own self-contained thing. That's one of the reasons I enjoyed Black Widow so much. Is it was the closest thing to that I think we've seen in quite some time. But this is not that show. This is not trying to be that. It's trying to be something else. It's trying to be a TV show version of a comic book, and to that degree, I think it achieves that with all of the benefits and limitations that implies. So, had a good time, but it wasn't. It wasn't perfect. I wouldn't even say it was excellent. It was very good, and it had a lot of problems, and it rushed through a ton of things, and in particular, the emotional beats I thought were pretty compressed and not great. The Loki Sylvie relationship, Loki's whole plot, character development, all that stuff was rushed. But at the end of the day, it still worked. Dan Gvozden, closing
I
thoughts?
think it met my expectations.
Yeah,
And I can't say that for everything that Marvel's put out, but it had some real serious high points. And I think we discussed them as we went through all the episodes of the show.
yeah,
And this has been a lot of fun talking to you about them.
yeah.
Um,
Bobby
and
Garcia in the chat says, "What did you all think of Jonathan Majors?" DS in the chat says, "Jonathan Majors did a bang-up job. He played the character creepy and jovial. Almost makes you want to appreciate him when the bad variant comes." I agree. Jonathan Majors crushed it this episode. He did a lot with, this character has been on screen for like 30 minutes in the entire series, and I thought he did a lot with that time. He made the most of it.
well, I
So
think you compare this to like how Thanos was introduced. If we are to believe that Kang is the new big bad, which I think is what we should assume, uh, infinitely better. I mean, I
really,
think in terms of how he's introduced versus Thanos, I mean, Thanos, we got like at the end of Avengers, he's like sitting on a throne, or like him grabbing the gauntlet.
yeah.
You
I
know, I
mean,
think,
but I would argue that like Infinity War was really Thanos' introduction, right? Like,
for sure. I
yeah,
think if Infinity War didn't do such a great job on Thanos, it probably would have fallen flat on its face. I mean, I think up until that point, Thanos really wasn't like a threat you took seriously. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like he really redeemed himself in that movie in terms of like how we treated him. To introduce Kang so early on in this like makes me think like he's going to be with us for a while and be a threat that we like are constantly checking in and thinking about in a
yeah,
way that like you could watch the first three um you know uh phases of Marvel and until the end of it not really think about Thanos all that much. And I think a lot of that is to have like do with like setting up the rules and the characters. But now that we're in it, I appreciate that like they're kind of just like set like laying it out there straight away. Like this is our new guy, and we're introducing you to him. Um, I do think it is bold to introduce him in the TV show. Um, watching the end credit scene of Black Widow, the post credit scene of Black Widow, where they started bringing in TV elements. I'm very curious how many people are going to be missing out on the connection there. I tend to think like the more
let's just be
you
careful for those who haven't seen Black Widow yet. By the way, Dan.
right,
Okay,
right.
yeah,
Yeah, I won't say what it is, but I do worry about like diluting the product so much uh, that you start losing your audience. Because because not everyone's going to have the time to watch all 6 episodes of Loki. Um, I know for a fact, like my wife who's watched WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier has only seen the first episode of Loki.
Right.
Um,
So how critical are the events of Loki going to be to the movies, right? Like if you watch the next movie, if you watch can you watch Multiverse of Madness, the Doctor Strange sequel, and it is still a good movie even though you haven't seen WandaVision or Loki? Like is that possible? Can you still enjoy it? Open question. Open question.
I mean,
So,
I worry about it because I think like we got to that point in the comics where, we're so far removed from issue one
right.
and things are so complicated. A lot of modern readers like have a real fear of picking up the first issue. There's this old mantra of like every comic is someone's first comic.
Yeah.
And it's true. Like my first comic I ever read was Amazing Spider-Man 375. And as a kid, I was like, whatever, 375, I'll jump in. It didn't really bother me. Um, but like we're rapidly approaching that level of complication with these movies and TV shows. And I do worry that like people might just get left off the train eventually. It's
We will see.
something that I think about.
We will see. We will see. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Some people are also asking, by the way, what's the next show we're going to cover? We have tentative plans to cover What If. One problem is I'm going to be out on vacation during What If. um, I basically never take vacations, like in general, because I need to podcast every week, and so I, in general, don't take vacations. But for the first time in 15 months, I'm going on vacation, and we are gonna have to see if we can figure out a way to make it work. Even though I'm on vacation, some of the episodes might be delayed, some of them might be audio only. I don't know. We're still gonna figure it out. The
Yeah.
way to make sure. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
And I'm a high school teacher, and my school year will start back up again, and we'll have to play with what that schedule looks like too. So,
Despite all
um,
appearances, Dan does not critique Marvel things full time, even though he could because he's talented enough.
well, that's
Uh,
very kind of you, Dave.
but yeah, so the best way to keep in touch with what we are doing and what we're up to, again, be a patron at patreon.com/Dave Chen. Check out Dan's podcast at amazingspider.com. Subscribe to this channel, hit that bell icon. Those are the best ways to make sure you find out about what we're doing next, assuming we do something next. But yeah, let's wrap this. Oh, somebody's bringing up Succession season 3. I actually do a podcast about that already with someone else. It's called The Sweet Smell of Succession. Check it out at successionpodcast.com. Also, Hawkeye. When is Hawkeye happening?
I think it's in the
October?
fall.
Yeah, in the fall. Yeah. So that's something else that we'll likely do. And yeah, again, hit like, subscribe, hit bell icon, hit patreon.com/Dave Chen, subscribe there, and you'll get all the latest information. So I want to again close by thanking all my patrons. I thanked them several times already, but without them, this wouldn't be happening. Thank you to my patrons. Thanks to you in the chat room. This has been, it's really like opened my eyes to what is we started doing these with Falcon Winter Soldier. That actually kind of went badly because the show, in my opinion, was bad, and there were people who showed up who just didn't like what I had to say about it. But with Loki, a show that I actually liked, it's really opened my eyes to like what is possible with like live broadcasts and with interactions and stuff like that. I actually should have turned on, I should have turned on the ability to like get like people can like buy rewards and stuff for you, like pay money for a live broadcast and stuff. So I might do that in the future. But I want to thank all the people in the chat room for showing up each week, contributing really funny, insightful commentary every week. It's been such a
Yeah.
blast. And finally, thanks to you, Dan Gvozden. There's not that many people that I think would add a lot to my understanding of a show and could create interesting content with me. And there's even fewer of them who actually say yes when I ask them to collaborate with me. And you have checked all those boxes. So thank you, Dan, for joining me on this very fun series of conversations and imbuing them with glorious purpose. Really appreciate you, Dan.
Well, this was a lot of fun. I enjoy the conversation. You've challenged me so many times in the past, and this. I watch these shows in the back of my head. I'm always thinking like, well, what does Dave think about? Is going to think about this? But that's like a good thing. It's like you're my Jiminy Cricket in some way. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
I appreciate it. And just one final plug: if people enjoy any of my thoughts about comics or the show, come and check out. I got a comic book podcast specifically about Spider-Man. Amazing Spider Talk. We go through the history of the character. So if you want more of me, that's the place to find me doing my stuff every week. Yes, it's a weekly show about Spider-Man, and trust me, there's enough to talk about. So come check me out on there or follow me on Twitter at Sup Spider Talk. I'd love to have you along for my journey, and I can't wait to do the next one with you, David.
Yeah. Bobby Garcia says, "I am Loki to your Mobius." I think that's a great. It's a great analogy, and that is going to wrap us up. We'll see you in the next one.